Hi, and welcome to the final podcast of the FLOWISION consortium. FLOWISION is a research and art project funded by the Kone Foundation that studies the visibilities and invisibilities of resource flows of energy and waste as part of the society in Russia and Finland. In this episode, we look at how Europe got Russia wrong, which is a fresh book by the project leader Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen. My name is Mika Perkiömäki. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Alexandria Institute of the University of Helsinki. In the FLOWISION project, I have worked on the ways how Russian media is handling issues related to climate change, energy, and the environment. So, our guest today is Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen, who, in addition to being our project leader, works as the professor of Russian environmental studies at the Alexandria Institute of the University of Helsinki. For those who are not familiar with Alexandria Institute, it is the Finnish Center for Russian, Eurasian and Eastern European Studies. Welcome to the podcast, Veli-Pekka.
Thank you very much.
As said, Veli-Pekka's book just came out, and it is published by Edward Elgar. The full title is How Europe Got Russia Wrong, Energy, Violence and the Environment. It is available open access at the address elgaronline.com. Just search for How Europe Got Russia Wrong. Veli-Pekka has written it, I think, during the ongoing Russian invasion to Ukraine. And I think it is best that I don't try to describe the goals of the book myself. I let Veli-Pekka himself the word, and my first question is, what is this book about, and why did you think it needed to be written?
Yeah, this book is about Europe's stance on Russia, how Europe understood Russia during the long 30 years after the Cold War, after beginning of the 1990s. So basically, it's current history, how Europe understood Russian agency, Russia's violence especially, and how Europe acted on Russia's agency and Russia's violence. And empirics is basically by far focusing on Finnish case, kind of Finnish context. But I think it's highly important that Finland as a empirical context to understand Europe's stance on Russia. The vector goes kind of from Finland to Germany and from Germany to Europe and to Russia. So when Finland defined Russia in politics, in economy, in business, in Russian studies, Germany has always been an important kind of mirror to which Finland portrayed itself and its own Russia policy, but also a broader European stance on Russia. So the vector goes from Finland through Germany to Russia. And I think this was important thing to unfold in this very situation where there is wide-scale violence in Europe and Russia's invasion. Certainly the kind of impetus to write this book has to do with this excessive ultra-violence, as I call it, coming from Russia. The kind of main research question that I pose is how we got Russia wrong, how we understood also Russia's violence in a broader terms, in broader social, cultural terms, and how we defined it. How we defined it in politics, political parties, politicians, institutions, how the business, especially energy business, defined Russia's violence and how we should engage with Russia. But also importantly, I think, for future of Russian Eastern European studies, I also focus on the Russian studies community, so to say. And I think this is valuable in itself because we need to look at how we talked about, as experts, how we talked about Russia during these last 30 years.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good general outlook to the book. Let's go into the details later. I think we could now take a brief look at each of the three parts of the book. First, in the introductory chapter, you lay out what you call your power tools, premises, methodological and theoretical commitments. Here, I think one of the main arguments is that Europe has falsely believed that tying Russia to a relationship of mutual dependence would guarantee that Russia does not become aggressive, because there is simply too much at stake economically. Would you like to elaborate on this tradition and how it became hegemonic in Europe?
Yes, we have to, in order to understand this understanding of interdependence, a mutual interdependence between Europe and Russia, we need to go back in history. We need to understand that it has roots in the Cold War era, and basically West German politics vis-a-vis Soviet Union and its continuation after the Cold War. Since, if you look at the early 1990s, the understanding that this West German-led Ostpolitik was successful because Soviet Union collapsed, Germanys were united, and the world looked very like a very positive place to live in that very moment. So there was no need to think about that we need a different kind of take on Russia, because this Ostpolitik that was relying on economic interdependence, but also appeasement in its policy vis-a-vis Soviet Union, was thought that this was the reason why Soviet Union collapsed. And in this very kind of frame, it was understandable that Germany, other European countries, wanted to continue the same tradition with this new Russia. And of course, during the 1990s, it's understandable that nobody thought that we need to change drastically this policy, because Russia seemed, at least on many fronts, to move towards stronger institutions, democratic practices, and so forth. But of course, then from early 2000s onwards, dark clouds started to gather in the sky, and you could see certainly that Russia is moving away from these principles that we thought that Russia was moving towards. And then in that very moment, when kind of Russia's violence started to increase in magnitude, first within Russia, but then also outside Russia's borders, Europe continued with the same idea that we need to maintain this interdependency, we need to appease Russia. So what Russia learned was that when Russia increased its violence towards democratic movement inside Russia or outside Russia's border, first in Georgia, then in Ukraine, Russia learned that Europe is actually how Europe is acting is that they think that this interdependency will prevail in any situation, and Europe gave Russia basically lots of kind of carrots in a situation when Russia was violent. So Russia learned that whenever we are violent, Europe will try to tame us by giving us new kind of economic or institutional opportunities. So rewarding basically Russia's violence. So basically the book is about this continuum of this Ostpolitik tradition, and there this understanding of interdependency linked to appeasement was very central.
Indeed, yeah. So despite the very much changed conditions after the Cold War, the similar politics continued, and your argument is that it was a huge mistake, right?
It was. It started to be a mistake in the early 2000s, but the closer we come to year 2014, and especially 2022, the bigger mistake it was. And I think that the most, important years when Europe could have done something differently is after 2014. So, of course, on the level of words, Europe has always condemned Russia's violence. Sometimes partly, but still condemned it. But how Europe acted on Russian violence has been disrewarding. And especially after 2014, if Europe would have taken a very different stance on Russian violence, it could be that there would be no such wide-scale war in Europe today. That's, of course, we don't know. That's history. But still, I argue in this book that how we rewarded also after 2014 Russia's violence against Ukraine, after Crimea, after Donbas, was the biggest mistake. And after 2014, you can also see that those parties in Europe, politicians, political parties, energy business first and foremost, but also Russia studies community by far, argued that that we need to maintain this kind of Ostpolitik tradition. We need to appease Russia in this situation, not to be harder on Russia, not to, for example, pose sanctions like we have posed sanctions on Russia after February 22. There was very wide understanding among these mainstream political parties, energy businesses, Russia studies community, that appeasement is the best option, even in this very moment when Russia is widely violent. And this episode from 2014 to 22 is the kind of most crucial when you think about also why I think it's important to unfold who said what, why, what were the arguments, why certain policies, certain understanding of Russia was promoted.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Now that you mentioned the period from 2014 to 2022, I start to wonder about European energopolitics against with Russia between that period. Can you name some particular concrete incidents connected to European energopolitics with Russia during this period that you would like to point out as problematic?
Certainly, and as I said, that I'm focusing in the Finnish and German kind of cases, how we understood Russia as whole of Europe understood Russia. And on the side of energy, of course, Finnish cooperation with Russia after 2014, the prime example is the nuclear power cooperation with Russian Rosatom, and the German case, of course, on the side of gas with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. So these are the kind of prime examples of how, especially via the energy, Europe was carrying out its Ostpolitik stance on Russia, trying to kind of, when Russia is violent, trying to provide more economic benefits to the table so that Russia eventually would be tamed. But of course, we know that wasn't successful, and February 22 showed the kind of real direction of Russia.
Yeah, thank you. Then another point of view you write about in the book is what you call Thanatopolitics, which relates to violence and tyranny. You have already talked about it. How you argue that only after 2022 Europe has made Russia to pay really pay a price from its violent deeds, and that until then the violent actions were condemned by Europe in words, but ultimately rewarded by yet more economic partnership projects, which would probably be what you just mentioned, Nord Stream 2 and Rosatom, things like that. But why do you think it was like this? I mean, what was the main reason why Europe did not act more seriously already before?
Well, I'm repeating myself. I think it was the kind of mainstream understanding that this Ostpolitik tradition has to continue, because there was this thinking that there's too much at stake for Russia. Russia is much more dependent on European markets than we are on Russian commodities, for example. So this thinking was there behind. But thinking about the violence and tyranny and how we understood that violence and how we understood and acted on deaths caused by Russia, inside Russia, in Ukraine, and so forth. I think that's important because, I mean, this Thanatopolitical approach is in this very moment important that, for example, the violence that took place in Chechnya or against Georgia or later against Ukraine, I think it's highly important to elevate that violence to a political force. That's the idea of Thanatopolitics, so that that there is a political change in Europe that values that violence to that extent that we don't continue business as usual politics with violent Russia, but we change them. In the chapter focusing on Thanatopolitics, of course, I look at also institutional cooperation with Russia, how we also on the institutional level rewarded Russia whenever Russia was violent. World Trade Organization membership is an example, and other kind of integrating Russia into Western-led, for example, democracy promoting organizations is another. And in that sense, also action on this side was something that where Europe rewarded Russia's violence, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. So you are listening to the final podcast of the FLOWISION project, hosted by Mika Perkiömäki, and today we are discussing Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen's book, How Europe Got Russia Wrong, with the author of the book, Veli-Pekka himself. Let's go back to year 2012, early 2012. I was living in Russia in St. Petersburg at the time, and I remember very well the huge protests that gathered after the parliamentary elections in December 2011, and in the wake of the presidential election in March 2012. And there was a lot of hope for a more democratic future because so many Russian people were gathering protesting against Putin coming back to power. And I'm thinking about this specific time in history, this early 2012, whether there was something that Europe could have done or should have done at that particular point, when it was clear that Putin was forcing his way back to the political top, repressing the Russian citizens, many of whom showed that they did not tolerate what was happening. And it looked evident that this is just the start of the repression and more measures are to come. So do you think there is something that Europe could have done at this point or should have done, or was it already too late to avoid what was evidently going to happen after that?
Of course, if we look at what Europe was in 2012, what was the political stance and the kind of grand understanding of Russia and the doctrine, I don't think there was anything we could have changed because, of course, this is history. But of course, if we think then that there would have been a different kind of understanding at the moment about Russia's trajectory, where Russia was heading towards, and the violence and tyranny that was in the air, so to say, then of course Europe could have and would have had many tools to influence Russia. One of them, of course, is the economy and the grand scale energy trade with Russia. Of course, is one of the first cases where Europe could have kind of said that if you move away from democratic institutions and democratic practices, then of course we won't trade with you. We don't do business with you. That would have been a very strong kind of political tool to use, but Europe didn't use it. Or institutional integration is another. We could have said that, okay, we won't accept you to World Trade Organization or Council of Europe or other institutions, but also starting, for example, with military trade. There was still, at the time in 2011, 2012, lots of military trade from major European powers to Russia. And symbolically of that was, of course, highly important that wasn't cut at the time. So France, Germany were still selling arms to Russia at the time. So starting from those, of course, Europe could have behaved differently.
Yeah, but these are all probably quite slow tools. I would say that it was probably too late anyway to affect in any way Putin's return to power, or how do you see?
Well, of course, at the time, still there was no war against Ukraine. There was no Crimea. There was no. So in that sense, if Europe would have then reacted very strongly, at least this understanding among Putin's entourage that Europe always behaves in a similar way to Russia's violence, that they will try to reward us with new economic benefits, would have not been the case. So the understanding of Europe by Russia would have been a different one. So in that sense, of course, we don't know how the world would have evolved if Europe would have behaved this differently. It could be that Russia would have been violent anyway. But at least certainly, if we think of the time span from 2012 till 2022, we provided lots of technologies, lots of money to Russia via trade. And what Russia did with this money was that it invested into violence. So military industry, the army, internal security forces and such, 1/3 of Russia's budget has gone to violence throughout these years. Now it's more than a half, of course, full-scale war and invasion, but it was by far European money that made it possible for Russia to invest into violence during these years after 2012.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. So we have now covered energopolitics and Thanatopolitics, and let's take also a brief look at ecopolitics, which is the third perspective you handle in the book. So this deals with environmental and climate issues between Europe and Russia. And what do you think were the major mistakes Europe made in this realm?
Well, actually, if we look at this ecopolitics, it's kind of the other side of the coin if we look at the energy world. Because the way we were unconditional with Russia concerning energy trade and, for example, always rewarded Russia after violence with these institutional economic benefits, we also didn't require from Russia environmental responsibility when it concerned, for example, that very same oil and gas that we were buying from Russia. So the environmental externalities of oil and gas production, for example, huge methane emissions or oil spills, soot from oil production and flaring, all these major environmental problems, not only local and regional, but also actually global, affecting Arctic climate change. We couldn't kind of require Russia to be more environmental friendly in its production, despite the fact that we were the biggest buyer of Russia's energy. And of course, the prime reason was that in foreign policy, but also in energy policy, we were dealing and having contracts with Russia on bilateral terms, not united European negotiated, for example, energy deals where these environmental requirements would have been, of course, we would have had much more stronger position on Russia to require those environmental standards in oil and gas production if we were as a united front and acting as a united political actor. But we failed to do that, and that's part of the kind of Ostpolitik tradition continuation and on the environmental side.
Yeah, so I think that pretty well concludes how energy, violence, and environment are all interconnected in this history between Europe and Russia. Okay, let us go back to the theoretical foundation and the methodological tools you have been using while writing the book. So the theoretical base lies, I think, heavily in Foucauldian studies of power hierarchies. And then methodologically, the book is written from the point of view of autoethnography, where events are partly narrated as the writer experienced them himself during the years spanning from the mid-1990s until today. Now, why did you choose the autoethnographic method, and did you anticipate any pitfalls in it, something that you wanted to avoid?
Yeah, certainly. I was, of course, have been using this kind of power analytics in my studies on Russian energy policy, for example, for a long time. So in that sense, the approach where I look at how words and deeds come together and how you can unfold and understand how power works when you look at words or kind of discourses and then action or strategical action and how they contradict, for example. And that's kind of methodological theoretical background that I've been used to use, and that's kind of understandable that I use it also in this book. But the autoethnographic method is something that I've never used before. And of course, I was aware of the kind of problematics related to that it's kind of could be understood as a kind of self-indulgence of a researcher telling that how I was right and others are wrong, and this kind of position, martyr-like position that, hey, look at how they treated me. But at the same time, if you look at the autoethnography, the idea is also to link your own experiences. Of course, I'm a Russia scholar with an environmental energy scholar with 25 years of experience in the field. And of course, I'm inside the kind of epistemic communities that I do research on. So in that sense, I think the autoethnographic method can show something more about how power works. So actually it fits well with the Foucauldian power analytics, because I can show that how on the micro level, that meta level issue of Ostpolitik, energopolitics or Thanatopolitics or Ecopolitics, how it functions on the level of individuals. So basically how the individual and politics or individual and culture are kind of encounter and what kind of practices of power you can actually unfold and reveal via this kind of method. And of course, I understand it can be criticized that it's some kind of cherry picking because I'm looking only at my own experience. But I tried to write the book in a sense that, of course, there's my own recall, my own experiences with encountering with politicians and institutions and business elite or Russia studies community, different scholars. But at the same time, I'm also looking at how those issues were dealt broadly in the society, for example, in the Finnish society, how those same issues were dealt by the media, or how the politicians were kind of engaging with these issues more broadly, not related to myself, but kind of societal discourses on a broader terms. So in that sense, I'm kind of combining them. So, and I think combined, it can show exactly that how power works on a kind of also on kind of how the meta and micro scales are kind of combined.
Yeah, right. Thank you. You write in the book that after the Cold War, no lustration took place in either Russia or Western Europe, unlike in many Eastern European countries where the old leadership was wiped away from power positions. And reading your book, which mentions multiple Western politicians, most notably Finnish and German, and researchers, and quite minutely describes their actions that you agree have followed the Ostpolitik idea, one is inclined to wonder whether the goal of this book might be such a lustration. How would you respond to someone that feels that way?
Certainly, it is part of lustration, but then, of course, we need to think what lustration is about. Of course, I'm not talking about in the Finnish or German context lustration in the terms of that there should be some kind of a legal process like, for example, was after the Nazi crimes in Western Germany during the 60s and so forth. No, I'm not talking anything along this line, but I'm talking about a need to do research, also this very, very detailed research on what people said and how we acted based on those discourses that people in political powerful positions were defining how we should act on Russia. So then, of course, it's not only about major politicians and political parties and institutions linked to politics, but also businesses. And of course, in this case, Europe-Russia relations context, of course, the energy industry has been extremely influential, defining how we should talk about Russia. And then, of course, the third one being the Russia studies community, where also very influential researchers have had quite significant power to define how we should understand Russia. So in that sense, lustration in terms that we certainly shouldn't forget how we defined Russia's violence, for example, throughout the 90s and 2000s, because certainly the idea is not just to kind of throw names at who said what, but to learn how we defined Russia and what were the maybe black boxes or kind of developments that we were not able to focus on that actually were revealed only after wide-scale violence by Russia after February 22. So in that sense, the objective of this kind of lustration is to learn from previous mistakes and to do a better policy, better strategy vis-a-vis Russia in the future.
Mm-hmm. And the autoethnographic passages describe many cases where the author was not able to conduct the kind of research he wanted because his superiors did not think it was worthwhile. And it looks like the author has had trouble in finding agency in the research circles because of this. He has, however, worked as an influential professor for now, 12 years? And the book describes how he is often invited to advise the Finnish parliament on energy and security issues, and even the Finnish president prior to his 2017 meeting with Russia's President Putin. Thinking about the power hierarchies, someone might think that the author actually has been himself also not so far from the inner circles of Finnish politics. How would you comment to someone who might be wondering about this?
Yeah, that's exactly how it is. In a sense, as a professor, I'm in the position of power. And of course, I describe also during or throughout this 30 years of autoethnography of how Europe understood Russia, also describe my own understanding of Russia. And it has certainly changed. So I also show my own change along the way. But yes, certainly this is something we scholars are asked to do actually on the level of our research institutions and universities. There's this societal outreach is highly important. There is a pledge by the rectors of the universities to engage with the society and give these expert statements, for example, that I have been doing for the Finnish parliament or the president. And there's no problem with those, because then you are in a specific kind of expert position. You are being asked to do something and you deliver a statement, and that's an open process. But what I'm kind of worried about in general about this kind of phenomenon where this kind of star-like professors are not only giving expert statements, but are also mingling with political elites to extent that the boundary between you being an expert and kind of pledge to be an objective expert outside the politics, the boundary becomes blurred. And this is, of course, a big issue in the sense that, of course, researchers and scholars are free to engage in politics, for example, or free to engage in different kinds of NGOs and civil society movements. And I'm not against that. But I think we need to be open. We need to be frank. What are our kind of entanglements and kind of political positions, also ideological positions, and that this book also discusses that we need to be more aware of positions of different scholars. That doesn't mean that these scholars wouldn't do good research. No, but I think this is part of the kind of process where we can actually enhance and increase the value of research by being more open. And of course, this issue that where you draw the line, what is too political, and where is your boundary as a researcher, that everyone has to define that by themselves. But if we're not aware that we have this power as experts and scholars, then we are lost.
Right, thank you. Yeah. As said, the book mentions many politicians and researchers by name, giving them either a label as representatives of the Ostpolitik canon, or as good ones, free of this historical pressure. What would you like to say to people that may feel offended about being mentioned as one of the bad guys, and who probably themselves would not feel that way, who probably often would feel they are somewhere neither good nor bad, trying to act as researchers?
Of course, what I'm proposing in the book is not to label people either good or bad. I'm trying to understand that how this Ostpolitik canon was built and maintained. And of course, then individuals are important. Individuals who have power. They are political leaders, they are business leaders, they are also expert leaders who are, for example, directors of research institutes. They have significant power. So in that sense, what I'm doing here, I'm not aiming low in a sense that I'm blaming people who are younger or in academic terms, kind of in their career in the early phases. No, I'm aiming my hits, so to say, towards power, towards upper layers of the society, and I think that's ethical. And if people are offended, if I say that they represent certain kind of canon, which I call Ostpolitik in this sense, I'm not, of course, responsible for their feelings. They can feel offended, but certainly, as I said, they have had and have political power also in the society and are in positions of power, and that position of power is something that should be and has to be able to be criticized.
Right. Okay, let's move on. I think we have time for one more question, and we can now move toward the final chapter of the book, which is a brief outlook to how you recommend that Europe should deal with Russia in the future in order to get it right this time. So what are your main theses here in this respect? What should we do with Russia in the future? And what do you think are the chances that Europe has actually agency to affect on Russia's future politics?
Yeah, and it starts from the topic that actually I don't really cover in my book, that Europe has to be militarily a strong kind of community. And that concerns also nuclear weapons. We don't know where the world is going. But actually what I discuss in the book is that we have failed to also use our economic muscles and institutional muscles in a way that would have had it have an impact on Russia. And in the future, what I propose is that to start with, we should have a Russia strategy. We have not had a Russia strategy in Europe. It has been, as I said, an unwritten strategy based on this old Ostpolitik understanding how to engage with Russia. And contrary to this Ostpolitik tradition, I think we should build a strategy where we state what we want from Russia, what kind of partnership we want from Russia. And then the strategy would rest on conditionality, that we would, for example, begin and continue trade with Russia if certain indicators are there, that Russia de-escalates, is less violent, is moving towards democratic institutions and such. And of course, I understand in this very moment, these issues seem far-fetched and naive, even looking at where Russia is at the moment. But the point being in my book is that we should think about this strategy in a very long haul, thinking about the next 30 to 50 years, that we should have a strategy where we pose our objectives on Russian development from the liberal democratic position that EU and Europe represents. And it's of course up to Russia then to take this task or not walk the walk with Europe along this kind of path that we propose for Russia. But still, I think it's important that we do this. We start compiling this strategy because it is important for Russians also, because there are unfortunately a minority of Russians, but there are Russians who think that there is another path for Russia, not an empire, not a violent colonial actor like it is today, but a democratic country that can be a normal, non-violent country. And for these people, we certainly need to bring some kind of hope of future. And if we don't provide it, then we're really lost. Of course, we can focus only on isolating Russia, like many are arguing today. We need that as well in this very moment. But at the same time, when we are isolating Russia, economically, politically, diplomatically, I think we need this kind of long-term strategy where we can show that we actually want good for Russians. And I think this is important.
Yeah, so to sum up, right now, isolation and preparation militarily, and then slowly try to see democratic changes in Russia and slowly engage
Yes.
during future decades.
Yes, but only giving these economic and other carrots when Russia does something positive. Not the contrary, like we have been doing in recent history during the last 60 years, actually. And this is how it's very, very fundamentally different than the Ostpolitik practice.
Yes, of course, yeah. Okay, I think this is the end of today's podcast. So we can conclude our final episode of the FLOWISION podcast. Thank you so much, Veli-Pekka, for agreeing to join us today. And thank you to our listeners. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you.